Okay, why don't we get going? Welcome, good afternoon. As looking at the list of participants, I think that everybody perhaps knows that I'm Dave Gustin. I'm the director of the School for the Future of Innovation Society. And welcome to what should be or should have been our spring break. Um, I'm sorry that you all have to be here without a spring break this semester, but it means that you will, get done with things a little bit earlier than normal, and at least we've got some good, interesting conversation for you to have today. As part of the series that we've been doing through our enlightening lunches this semester in transitions to justice, we have today speaking with us Catherine Bracy. Catherine is the co-founder and CEO of Tech Equity Collaborative. And before founding TEC, she was Code for America's Senior Director of Partnerships and Ecosystems, where she grew Code for America's Brigade program into a network of over 50,000 civic tech volunteers in more than 80 cities across the United States. She also founded Code for All, a global network of Code for organizations with partners on 6 continents. And the reason, as you might imagine, for inviting Catherine to talk with us is that there are a set of these cognate concepts that are playing around in the world: tech equity, responsible innovation, public interest technology, and so on, that are core elements to what it is that we do as a school in the School for the Future of Innovation Society, and that inform how it is that we approach issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and this theme of transitions to justice in the Enlightening Lunch series. So, as you know, I do these introductions very briefly. I will turn it over to Catherine, and we'll continue in the general mode, where Catherine will talk for 20 to 30 minutes. We'll turn it over to general Q&A. At the top of the 1 o'clock hour, we'll turn off the recording. And unfortunately, Catherine has a previous engagement, so she'll only be able to spend another 15 minutes or so with us past the top of the hour in that more frank and unrecorded conversation. So, Catherine, please, welcome.
Thanks, David. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and hopefully everybody can see that. Just let me know if you cannot. Thank you for having me. I need to apologize in advance because you're likely to hear my dog in the background. He loves to be center of attention, and so he perks up every time I start talking into the computer screen. And I will try to make this as interesting as possible to make up for the fact that you've lost your spring break, and encourage you to, ask questions. I'm going to try to end my presentation a little early so that there's more time to get into the conversation, since I have to leave at 12:15 Pacific time. So with that, I will start with a story about Uber buying an old Sears department store building in downtown Oakland. This was late 2015. I think this was announced. They announced that they were buying this old abandoned department store and moving about 2,500 employees into that building. And the community responded very negatively to that. So they launched this No Uber Oakland campaign. I was very interested in this development because at the time I happened to live right across the street from this building. So I was very interested in who my new neighbors were going to be. But also, as David sort of laid out, my professional background is at the intersection of technology and civics. So professionally, I was also very interested in this dynamic between a large tech employer and the community around it. And, the fact that the community not only didn't see value in Uber moving thousands of really good jobs to their neighborhood, they actually saw it as an active threat. And that got me thinking, and to me, that didn't seem like an irrational reaction, but that really sort of clarified some things in my mind and caused me to start thinking about how we had gotten to this place in our economy where what was at the time the most valuable privately held company in the world could announce that they were moving thousands of good jobs to a place where the median income is about $25,000 a year, and the community would react very negatively to that. And of course, they were reacting to this idea of a tech company coming into town. I started doing a lot of thinking about, what was behind this. Was this something that was specific to tech? Was this something that was, specific to California or the Bay Area region? Or was this really just late stage capitalism coming home to roost in my front yard? And as someone who grew up in outside of Detroit in the 80s, it just felt very like something had gotten lost in our economy, where my expectation, if when I was growing up, was that if a company had made a similar announcement, there would have been celebration. So what had changed? How had we gotten to this point? And why was the community at large looking at tech as the enemy? So what I found, and I'll say at this point, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually everything I'm going to talk about is very specific to California and the Bay Area. But I think especially now in the era of sort of a trend towards remote work, we'll see how long that lasts. This is starting to become true in cities across the country and is really a national issue. So while I'm using California examples, I hope that you'll find relevance for Arizona or wherever else you may be. Really what the community was reacting to wasn't so much Uber, but it was the manifestation of decades of active underinvestment in these communities like downtown Oakland. I don't know how familiar you all are with the concept of redlining, but it's very, the US government and local governments across the country actively and explicitly made policy that kept Black homeowners primarily from living in and buying property in certain neighborhoods, and then refused to sort of lend the same mortgage products that they were giving to white families in the non-redlined areas to those Black families in redlined areas, which has persisted, is basically sort of the foundation for segregation in housing that we see today. On the right, you'll see a foreclosure map from the Great Recession of the last decade. It maps pretty closely to the neighborhoods that were redlined. And more recently, this is data for California. As you can see, we have been consistently underbuilding housing for the last several decades, but it's particularly been bad since the Great Recession. And this is actually a trend that is true for almost the entire country. And I think anyone who's tried to buy a house in the last couple of years knows that there is a big shortage of housing supply. In California, it also happens to be concentrated, that shortage is concentrated among housing that is affordable to middle and lower wage workers. So this graph, RHNA is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. This is something very sort of wonky formula that every region in California is required to develop a number for the target housing units that they need to build at various affordability levels. This is Silicon Valley and Bay Area's progress to those goals for the current RHNA cycle. As you can see, there is a real disparity between what would be considered sort of market rate or luxury housing, and then middle and lower, housing that is affordable to middle and lower wage workers. And just to put this in perspective, what is considered low income in San Francisco right now is $100,000 a year for a family of four. So we're talking about a pretty wide swath of the workforce that is essentially being priced out of housing in the Bay Area, and for whom we are not building any new housing. So the private market, really, because housing is so expensive to build in California and in the Bay Area in particular, the private market is really only able to meet the needs of the very high earners. And as you can imagine, what that has done is really increase the pressure on middle and lower wage family budgets, to the extent that we are seeing basically one-to-one displacement of lower wage families by upper wage families in Silicon Valley. So, and, I think there's been a lot of stories recently about how rents have gone down during the pandemic in places like San Francisco. And while that is true, if you look at this graph, they have not gone down nearly enough to sort of make up for what has been a long trend in massive increases in rents over the last several years. So again, it's a crisis of displacement. We are essentially pushing out lower and middle wage families and making it impossible to really live in the Bay Area in particular, unless you make well into the six figures. So that is all the background that my neighbors were reacting to at the time. And so I hope that what you come to understand from seeing that is that it wasn't tech that caused these underlying structural issues. I mean, these were seeds that were planted, decades, if not centuries ago. But tech is the industry that is booming, or was in the last decade. And there was sort of a sensibility among the tech community that they didn't have a responsibility to be part of the solution. And maybe that's a little unfair, but they were really disengaged from these conversations about how we solve these local problems, and didn't really see it as their fight. And that really fueled this toxic, and it was very toxic, civic dynamic between tech and everybody else, where everybody else sort of viewed tech as in it for themselves, didn't care. They had their private bus. Public transportation didn't work well enough, so they just, bought their private buses, and everything was provided for their workers on campus. And rents were going up, and nobody was really doing anything about it. And it just was a very ugly situation to live through. And so this was really the context in about early 2016 when I started Tech Equity. And then something happened that was sort of a watershed. I don't know if you all remember, but there was a big milestone in 2016, an election that really caused a reckoning among the tech community and drove tech workers to start doing a lot of reflecting on what their role had been in the Trump election, and the sort of environment of disinformation and undermining democracy that went alongside that election. And it really gave rise to this phenomenon, I guess you'd call it an awakening, among tech workers about their civic responsibility broadly. And I will never forget. So at this point, Tech Equity was very young. I started working on Tech Equity in early 2016, and we were making a bet that this broad community of sort of rank and file tech workers could be activated if they were given a vehicle through which they could activate, and if somebody gave them an actual invitation to participate. But that was actually it was certainly unproven. And it was a little bit out in left field at the time. And I remember early 2017, this was right around when all the protests were happening at the airports around the immigration ban. I had a meeting in downtown San Francisco on a Tuesday afternoon. It was like a Monday or Tuesday afternoon in January. And I was turning a corner, and I heard this commotion off in the distance. And it sounded like a protest chant or something. So I started trying to follow it, find where it was coming from. And I remember rounding a corner and seeing coming towards me a sort of loosely organized band of Google workers who were chanting and waving protest signs, almost like this picture here. And on a Tuesday afternoon. And that for me was a real, moment of, oh, okay, there's something really deep going on here. So that was exciting, that all of this energy had now been newly awakened, and that this swath of people who are obviously extremely privileged, and because they're extremely privileged, have a lot of civic power. We're now realizing that they had this power, and we're starting to ask how they should be using it. But much of that energy at the time was directed at national politics, or what sort of started developing was organizing around sort of internal grievances at the specific companies. So we've seen protests um, against, or actions against, Google for how they were treating sort of victims of sexual harassment, and a whole wider range of, there was a whole uprising at GitHub around their relationship with ICE. So all of these things were sort of either focused on national issues or sort of internal issues. And I, of course, was interested in how do we get that civic energy focused around economic issues, particularly the economic impact that tech companies and the tech community have in the neighborhoods where they are based. And so that's really what tech equity became. And this is sort of our mission statement. We are trying to channel that civic power of the tech industry into advancing a policy agenda that we think will make it so that as tech grows, more people benefit from that growth. And initially that meant, a company, maybe not Uber, when in 2015, when that announcement in Oakland happened, Uber was, didn't have quite the reputation that it has today. So maybe that wouldn't be so great now, but some other large tech company can announce they're moving to a place like downtown Oakland, and the community would celebrate that, see where that kind of growth was actually creating opportunity for them instead of driving inequality and displacement. And we're doing that, we're advancing that agenda by mobilizing the tech community. And that includes both rank and file tech workers and tech companies. And we do it in three ways, just briefly, so you know kind of how we approach this work. First, through education. I mean, I think it's probably not a surprise that most of the people who work in tech don't have a lived experience of being on the economic precipice. And so we do a lot of educational programming to help them understand the context in which, the things they see on the street are playing out. And then, of course, we advance public policy. The agenda I mentioned that we think will make a growing tech economy create broader opportunity. And then we engage companies in this work as well. And there's sort of a different approach to engaging corporations than there is in engaging individual employees. And I'm happy to talk about that if there are questions about it. And then, of course, the issue areas that we focus on are housing and workforce and labor. These are, I think, in my mind, the two most critical economic equity issues, and certainly in that tech will touch. And so, by covering these two things, I think we hit a lot of the sort of economic justice focus areas that we are trying to address. We also have worked on sort of more fundamental structural economic issues like taxation and fiscal policy, but those still are sort of underlying these two other issue areas. And of course, these two things are very closely connected, as you saw from that graph before. We can't talk about increasing job quality if every sort of increase in pay or compensation that workers get is eaten up by increasing housing costs. So these two things are very overlapping. I said at the time in 2016 that it was kind of far out there to suggest that if tech workers were asked to participate, that they would actually show up. That was sort of a hypothesis that I felt confident about, but didn't have evidence for. And I was, pleased to see that as soon as we asked, as soon as we sort of created the space for tech workers to really engage locally, they did show up. And so we're about 5 years old now. The first 3 years, we really validated that hypothesis that if they were asked, if they were given the opportunity, tech workers really would use their power to advance this agenda. And one example that I want to focus on is a bill that we worked on in 2019, which is the largest expansion of tenant protections in American history, actually, is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 that passed in California. was signed into law in October of 2019, which established basically a rent cap, which is it is a cap that is above what sort of traditional rent control would be. The idea being that we want to create some stability in the rental market, but we also want to create room for landlords to make a profit and for developers to still be able to realize and build privately funded housing. And it also included just cause eviction protection. So essentially, a landlord had to have an actual good reason, AKA just cause, in order to evict somebody. So this was a big, and this applies to almost every renter in California. So this was a huge stabilizer on that rental market. We started by working with our partners at UC Berkeley, the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, actually write the bill. And this came out of us looking at the available options for what was happening in the housing space and realizing that there really weren't any great ideas, any new innovative policy ideas that had any political traction, that were politically viable and would actually create protections for all renters. We were able to kind of use we really focused on building bridges. So, as tech was really seen as the enemy, it was really important for me in the first year of building the organization to start building trust for the organizations and the communities that saw tech as the enemy. And so that was really a key part of sort of creating a policy that everybody could get bought into. We then co-sponsored the bill alongside a bunch of more traditional tenant advocate organizations, and really were able to bring the tech community into that conversation and help advance the viability of the bill, because we were, sort of a business interest or sort of, more privileged constituency that was also advocating for this. It wasn't just the usual, socialist grassroots organizations that were much easier for politicians to dismiss. When we were showing up, bringing tech workers to testify at committee hearings and getting tech companies to endorse the bill, it was a lot harder for the moderates in the legislature to ignore that. So we really played a role in mainstreaming the idea, I guess you would say. And then importantly, as this narrative trajectory goes, and probably more relevant to you all, we now have this policy in place, but there wasn't the policy did not create extra capacity to actually get it implemented. And so what good is policy if people can't actually realize it in their day-to-day lives? And so we used our unique skills in the technical sphere to build a site that essentially helped people self-enforce their rights. And that has had thousands of renters have used it to find out whether the law covers them, whether their landlord is unfairly raising their rent or illegally raising their rent or trying to evict them. So that for us was a really great, example of the work that we try to do, which is to advocate for innovative policy, bring tech to the table to actually get it passed, and then use our unique skill set on the implementation side to make sure that it's actually impacting people's lives. So I know, David, you kind of talked about at the outset, the actual, how do we think about the role, not just of tech companies in their communities, but also the economic impacts of their business practices, the tools and products and services that they are building and selling. And that's an area that we have started to get into. And just quickly, 2 areas that we're working on. The first is this practice that is widely used in the tech sector and starting to be adopted in other areas of the economy, is this over-reliance on contractors. And this has been a very hot topic in California over the last couple of years. But tech companies, this isn't just about gig workers. This is about the people who go into the building every day, or at least did when we were not fully remote. But the big tech companies actually employ more contractors than they do full-time employees. And there's a whole bunch of, this is a pretty bad labor practice generally. And it is extremely inequitable, we think, but don't know for sure, that a lot of the contractors are actually, that sector of the workforce is actually more diverse than the full-time workforce. And so there's this sort of, this article calls it 2-tiered. It is sort of an internal caste system where, contractors who are more likely to be underrepresented minorities don't have the job protections, mobility opportunities, and compensation that the full-time employees have who are more likely to be white. And so this is a project that we're embarking on to sort of shed light on that contracted workforce and to establish some policies, both corporate policies and public policies, that will create some protections for that class of worker, which will of course have implications not just for the tech workforce, but for the economy overall. And then the other area we're looking at is something we're calling a housing AI initiative, which of course, we didn't go into depth on the ways in which racial bias is encoded in the housing system. But it's pretty clear that if you take the offline systems that we've been using for the last several decades or century, and just translate that into technology, all we're going to do is amplify and sort of clarify the existing bias in housing by using technology, sort of garbage in, garbage out. And so we are working on a set of projects that would not only try to prevent as much harm as possible through the use of technology, or sort of re-encoding bias in the housing system through like machine learning algorithms that decide creditworthiness, but also looking at ways that we can use technology to actively combat inequity and create fairer tools that will give us a more positive roadmap forward in housing. And we're partnering with groups like the National Fair Housing Alliance here, who is suing Redfin for some of the ways they're using technology to sort of reinforce bias in housing in major US cities. So that's quickly a little bit about how tech equities work is evolving. We are still interested in sort of the physical impact of tech companies on the communities around them, and how engaged tech workers and companies are with those issues. But we're also starting to look at, okay, how do those values then translate back inside the companies, and what role can tech workers play in making sure that the products and services that they're creating aren't re-embedding bias into our economy. So I'll stop there. I know I went on for longer than I said I would, but I am excited to hear what you all think and answer any questions that you might have.
No, Catherine, that was just perfect, actually, in terms of timing. Thank you so much. And I'm really impressed by, if you will, the nuance of the agenda, that it has elements not just of, things that we see from other places in tech for good, but it really, from what you showed us, explores the interweaving of tech and social policy, of legacies of previous social policies, of how tech might reinforce structural inequities that we have previously seen, but might found ways out of it. It really is quite a lovely, nuanced agenda. So thank you for sharing that with us. And let's see who might have some questions for you, or comments or praise for that matter.
That was really interesting. Thank you. I was wondering where you see universities in the mix of all this, since they're these days often attracting some of these tech companies to areas.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer to that. I mean, I know that this has been long been an issue with, I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, so I kind of have a deep understanding of the relationship between a large university and the community around it, especially in a smaller town. And so the tension, the town gown tensions, I mean, are not anything that's new. And there are a lot of parallels between that dynamic and what we're seeing with tech companies. And there may be some lessons from those, community benefit arrangements or whatever that universities have with the towns where they're based, especially for public universities, that tech companies could draw on for how we make sure that those institutions aren't, siloed, that they understand their relationship with the broader community, and that they see a sort of responsibility or opportunity to engage with that community. This dynamic where, universities act as a magnet for tech-driven growth is a real thing. And I think it adds sort of a layer of complexity to that conversation that I'm not sure we fully understand. But it's certainly like I gave a similar talk at Stanford a few weeks ago, and there seemed to be not a lot of like the focus was very short term. And if we're talking about what role the tech community plays in the local economy, Stanford really, I mean, and to a lesser extent, Cal were the reason that Silicon Valley grew up where it grew up. And so there is a lot of accountability there for the local university. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think it'd be interesting if universities, particularly public universities, were to use the leverage that they have with the local tech economy to make them be better neighbors. So, hey, you're coming here because you want to take advantage of our workforce. The growth of your business relies on a good relationship with the local university. Well, we're going to ask you to do X, Y, and Z, engage with the local community in this way. And that could be a really interesting way that, universities use their leverage to make sure that the growing tech economy locally is more equitable. What is it like in Arizona?
Dave?
Well, it's an interesting question that, and it's with respect to ASU, we're sort of, or at least we view ourselves as unique in that respect, because first, Arizona has a paucity of large public institutions, unlike California, unlike Boston Route 128, and to a certain extent, even unlike other places that have seen significant tech development. Certainly unlike Manhattan Research Triangle, and so ASU, at least in Phoenix, which, as you probably know, fifth largest metropolitan area, but over a geography that's larger than LA County. So it's a very weird place. Arizona is underserviced by its 3 state universities. There are fewer places per student for potential student than many other places in the country. So we don't provide great opportunities. And there's, compared to other higher tech places, there's a paucity of venture capital and so on and so forth. So in that context, ASU has quite explicitly over the past, I guess it's now half dozen years, articulated what the university has created as its own charter, which is taking fundamental responsibility for the well-being of the community that it serves and in which it's embedded. So that kind of ethic that you described, where the university would take an active role in brokering relationships between, say, employers and their disposition to workforce and to local consumers and so on, would be a kind of role that ASU could conceivably bring itself to see. I don't know any particular details that we've had in doing that, but ASU does have extensive partnerships with the local sort of, a high-tech entity across a number of industries that have, at least in some attempts, been turned toward the benefit of communities. So, in the recent pandemic, if you think about things that the university has done both with the public sector and with the private sector in mobilizing COVID testing and more recently the vaccinations, the university has played a very productive role in doing those kinds of things. So the role itself is something that ASU has that sort of goal as a productive broker and as an entity that is active for the well-being of the community is one that the university has taken on. I don't know where it's manifest specifically in things that I think that you might have been alluding to, but that is actually on on a research agenda that I have around public interest technology that I could share with you later. I saw Eric Fisher next.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Catherine, for a great talk. It's really inspiring to see the work you're doing and the response you're getting. So I've got a question that picks up on a little bit on Dave's reference to public interest technology, Sean's question about the role of universities, and your concluding statement about the helping tech workers, helping ensure that the products and services they're developing don't re-embed bias into the economy and into society. I really like that phrasing. So that dovetails with a lot of the work I do and my students do, although it's not necessarily focused on economic inequities, but it's more focused on the idea of tech workers becoming more conscious and aware that there are these sort of cultural and historical biases that can act as inputs to tech, and to just become a little bit more aware of those so that they can be better brokers. And I just want to, just get your sense, if you will, of, some of the leading tools or discourses or movements out there that really focus on that aspect. Not so much educating tech workers or developing policies, but the core work that they do and how they can be more reflexive agents, and what role we, at the university, in terms of theorizing and coming up with models and concepts that can pull everything together, how can we best help really sort of pull together these different efforts and help them move forward?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have a lot of thoughts about, the most effective methods to actually get tech companies to be more ethical. The changing hearts and minds and developing a new culture and set of habits and practices for the workforce is, I think, an effective way, but it is a long-term strategy. I can talk a little bit about how I see that happening. For us, the most effective strategy we have in the short term is regulation, public policy. And so that's why we focus so much on that. I have talked to dozens, if not hundreds, of executives at tech companies over the last 5 years about how we, create more ethical tech companies or build more equity into the industry. And my takeaway is they're not going to do it voluntarily. And this, I guess, shouldn't be a surprise. It really is just like corporate theory. They're not going to voluntarily adopt at scale the kinds of practices we need in the short term without external pressure from regulators. And that's true even when there have been industries like, or there's a serious economic dynamic at play that is making it hard for them to not do that because they're losing money by not being ethical. And in other industries where we have seen, sort of more ethical industry standards or more progressive, I guess, industry standards, I'm thinking of like, the recent announcements by car companies that they're going to be fully electrified by 2030. That is driven by an external regulatory conversation that they are responding to, and that has been going on for a long time. So we're not going to get there without focusing on the public policy piece. But having said that, I do think that where we can create resiliency against huge ethical lapses is in companies, especially in fintech companies. I think this is really important, and super especially in the fintech companies that deal in the housing space or creditworthiness, is really just to create exposure opportunities. And there's a whole sort of new arising ecosystem that's called ethical tech, which is like building tools and creating checklists and doing, all these sort of things that they're not going to work in a vacuum. Like if you put those sort of, hey, have you thought about this potential bad outcome into a context where people have no lived experience of, any potential bad outcome of technology, it's never going to work, right? And so the only way to create that is to drive exposure. And I was mentioned the National Fair Housing Alliance, and they are actually embarking on a tech equity initiative as well that we're hopefully going to be partnering on. And I was talking to the CEO of National Fair Housing Alliance, and they're, obviously they've seen a lot of benefit in using lawsuits to get companies to pay attention and change practice, which is a form of the regulatory environment. But she said, I was expecting her to say that there were going to be all these like newfangled tools that they're building and whatnot. And she said, the most effective thing that we've seen work is just education. Like the companies where we go in and talk about the history of civil rights and housing have better outcomes. They have fairer outcomes. So, and just creating that exposure, and not just like the education piece, but the participation piece. So for us, those two things are very tightly linked. We don't just help people understand the history of redlining, but we engage them in campaigns to change housing policy where they live. And those experiential opportunities to understand their power are really effective at getting them to maybe raise their hand when something's going wrong, or to spot something that could be bad before it gets too far down the production line and is actually hurting people. So, I do think regulation is the big lever we have, but we also do have a lot of promise in sort of the cultural change inside the industry as well.
Great, thanks.
What about, if I can interject you for a second, what about, tech folks, tech savvy folks as consumers as well? Because it has always sort of flummoxed me that, I was a late adopter to ride sharing apps because, quite frankly, in my opinion, Uber was built on a criminal model of operation. And
how'd that work out? Did you single-handedly bring Uber down?
no, but it seems to me that this is a group of people who could just so much easily be more informed consumers.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've seen boycotts. I don't know how many times there's been an alternative to Facebook that has sprung up. I mean, it's just the fact of the matter is they're too powerful. And one reason I'm actually starting to write a book on this is, the forces of venture capital and the way that, the economic infrastructure that the tech industry is built on creates this concentration of power that it's the only effective, the only institution that has enough power to counterbalance it is really government. And we can participate in that by participating in government, forcing our elected officials to regulate the companies. But I don't think that it's going to work to kind of vote with our wallets here. Even after the sort of peak Uber in 2017, when everybody hated them, they still went public. They're all billionaire. All the people who started Uber and who made all the crappiest decisions at that company are billionaires. They don't care that you stopped using Uber. So like the incentives, that doesn't, the sort of bad PR is, it's in the mix, but it's really not, it's not a game changer, I don't think.
Great. I saw Matt, and I think Eric might want to jump back in.
Great, thank you, Catherine, for being here and for that super inspiring talk. I wanted to ask you about strategy. Then we've just heard about consumer power as a strategy, but maybe not that effective. You talked about education and exposure as a strategy for opening a space in which tech workers can show up and participate in in their communities and be connected and stuff like that. And you've mentioned this regulatory power in government that provides a context to incentivize companies to be more ethical and responsible. So I wanted to ask you about, but you've also said, you know, CEOs don't change by themselves, that these companies are just too powerful and couldn't care less ultimately, unless their bottom line's being hurt somehow. And so I want to ask you about unions and Google's latest workers' efforts to unionize. Some of those efforts to unionize actually or intersect with efforts at U of A and ASU, where we've recently had the emergence of a union that has the same parent branch as the Google Workers Union. And so there's a kind of a recognition, it seems, that there's another strategy needed, which is really about building people power. And so I just want to get your take a little bit on where does that piece fit into the landscape of leverage levers that you talked about. Sorry, it's a bit long-winded.
It's a good question, and I think the answer is it fits into that category of, you know, we can change the culture, you know, among like hearts and minds. It's going to take a long time, and so there's a lot of work to do to get to the point where worker organizing, you know, formal worker organizing within the tech sector is going to be a counterbalance, like has enough power to counterbalance corporate power. But even aside from unionizing, I think tech workers are probably, you know, currently the single biggest sort of influencer for tech company decision making. You know, I don't know that they have the tipping point power to like actually make long-term sustainable change, but it's expensive to hire these workers. And if we get to a point where enough of them are saying, I'm not going to work at a company that doesn't share my values, then I think we will start to see change, maybe around the edges. But that is right now, aside from the regulatory piece, the biggest lever I think we have. But you know, another thing about unions to note is that we meaning sort of the United States, has used public policy to erode worker power by making it harder to join unions, by sort of taking away power from unions and making it harder for workers to organize, right? And so if we don't address that, then it's going to be an even bigger lift, right? So that is another way in which we need to be focused on public policy that makes it easier for workers to unionize, and that holds companies accountable when they crush unions.
Okay, I think Eric wanted to jump back in.
Yeah, and then I see some women on the line. If any women want to chime in, I'd love to hear from you all. No, these are great questions from the guys, but.
Yeah, good point. So I'll just be brief then to make space for others. I was wondering, you mentioned VC, venture capital, as a sort of ungoverned force, possibly ungovernable force, although that remains to be seen. And I just wanted to get your take on groups like the Omidyar Network, who actually have lots of residual income, I think in that case from eBay, and claim to be, you know, investing in responsible technology. I know they do a lot of education and campaigns, but you know, do you see that as a positive development? And you know, what are some future developments that might follow on?
Yeah, and it is a kind of weird paradox, honestly. And full disclosure, we have been funded by Omidyar in the past. And I think another example of this, which is currently our largest funder, is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. You know, on the one hand, CZI in particular spends a lot of money on radical stuff that will, I think, change the structural economic inequities that are driving a lot of this. But, Facebook is seen as sort of the biggest, perpetrator of unethical tech, and are certainly have, more power than they should. So it is a weird thing. And I would love to know what Mark Zuckerberg is thinking there. I mean, I've never met him, but it does seem like he takes very bipolar approaches to his decision with engaging in public policy through Facebook versus his engagement with public policy through the foundation. So it is a weird thing. I don't know what goes through billionaires' minds. I mean, it is crazy. But yeah, I mean, I have lots of thoughts on venture capital and how we regulate it. I mean, venture capital wasn't always as unregulated as it is now. And there's no reason we can't go back to a place where, there are more guardrails on the investments and the incentives that those investments create, which I think have driven a lot of the, negative societal outcomes that we've seen over the last 10 years. Ladies, not to put anyone on the spot.
I have one.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi. I really enjoyed your talk. It reminded me of, some of the things in the past that tech has done. I mean, it's quite different from this, I should say. In the past of going and doing outsourcing strategies to developing countries for cheap labor. And, the contract worker initiative that you brought up kind of reminded me of that. So it seems like they have ways of getting around that lever of the employees possibly getting to the point where they're a tipping point to influence. So how do you see that as a challenge, as something to work on?
Yeah, and again, this is where public policy really has to play a role. In California, we just went through about a year and a half of 2 years of progressive court decisions and then legislation that encoded, a stronger, clarified the employee classification conversation, and really came down on the fact that, gig economy workers were actually employees. And then we had a ballot initiative, which the companies put a ton of money into, that really carved out a space from that. So that court decision and that law applied to all contractors across industries. And this ballot initiative carved out gig drivers, basically, essentially delivery workers and like Uber and Lyft drivers. And that is a real problem. And the companies are actively looking to advance that in other states across the country. And so we're going to need statewide and national legislation in order to protect that classification structure that really, the effect of it is to put all of the risk of doing business onto the workers and removes the risk from, the corporations, which is a problem. I mean, just in the economy. So that is, again, a place where like a real regulatory front, and that's why we're launching this project. I mean, we're looking at a class of worker that has gotten zero attention in this whole thing, which are, the other kinds of workers that companies contract out for. And that's everything from, the people who work in the mailroom to, the trainer in the on-campus gym, to content moderators, to recruiters, and there's no visibility into how that workforce is treated, and I think is going to become a growing sector of the economy going forward, especially as we enter the sort of economic recovery. And so how are we making sure that we have visibility into how that ecosystem works and can get ahead of I think the exploitation that's going to happen for a lot of those kinds of employees who really are at a position where they're trying to get like their first foot on, the bottom rung of the ladder into the middle class. And they see this as a pathway into like a better paying career, but they're assuming all of the risk and with no guarantee that that is actually going to result in a career advancement opportunity. So it's really an interesting space, and is going to be not just, California in many ways is sort of the vanguard for a lot of national policy, but it's not going to be just a thing here in California, it's going to be everywhere. And actually, there is a company we're working with who will remain nameless, but that it has is working on driverless car technology, and they're using Arizona as a testing ground because the regulatory environment is much more permissive there. And so, it's going to be a sort of multi-jurisdictional strategy that we're going to have to take.